The fog that rolled over the downs of Sussex on the first morning of Michaelmas was not, strictly speaking, deadly, although the local canon Wilberforce, mistaking metaphor for meteorology, insisted it reminded him of the ancient plagues of Egypt. Lord Peter Wimsey, who had taken a borrowed Bentley into the village of Coldmead to recover from what he called a particularly predatory patch of bachelorhood, corrected the canon with more glee than delicacy. "It's rather more in keeping with the final canto of Inferno, don't you think, Canon? All that muffled wailing, and people frozen to their ears in the ice, though I dare say you'll argue for Sodom and Gomorrah." He removed one kid glove with deliberation, examining the fingers as though expecting sin to appear under the nails. "You theologians are always a little literal about these things." The canon, already pinched of face and affronted of collar, made the sort of sound one associates with ecclesiastical digestion. They had been standing uneasily in the lane just outside Grey Lady's, an ancient manor house more decrepit than picturesque. It had once been a recusant stronghold and later, for a brief spell, a Quaker retreat. Now it had belonged to Miss Honoria Dancy, a woman of 89 years who had died the night before in what appeared to be an excess of solitude. "Heart failure," pronounced Dr. Cotterill, puffing into his moustache like a man asked to diagnose ghosts. In bed, no signs of a struggle, a life of fasting and ferociously high Anglicanism. "Frankly, I'm surprised she lasted this long." "Quite," said Wimsey, raising an eyebrow at the physician's delightfully Gothic phrasing. "No struggle, you say, but do we find the usual entrapments of an octogenarian demise? The smelling salts, the maid's trembling knock at an unresponsive door, or, let me guess, no maid at all and a house with more silence than staff?" Cotterill looked vaguely embarrassed. "Ah, well, there's a nurse, of course, one of those private agency women, Miss Cray, rather damp sort of person, pale, frightfully proper. There's also a cook, but she doesn't stay in. Comes from the village during the day. No one heard anything. No one ever does in houses like this," murmured Wimsey. He turned his attention to the building, whose windows stared back at him with the indifference of the dead. Grey Lady's was not so much decayed as resentfully aged, its ivy like neglected hair, its turrets sagging under the weight of years and mildew. Wimsey noted, with the precise interest of one who had once lectured the Royal Society on the acoustics of antique staircases, that the upper windows had been scrubbed clean, except for one, in the east gable, that remained mottled with grime. "Odd. That it should be that one," he said, half to himself. "Eh?" said the canon, whose patience had begun to curdle. "What is?" "That window. The one that still has its film. Curious placement, don't you think? Facing away from the lane, but not quite toward the garden. Overlooks nothing in particular save the ruin of the old dovecote." He glanced back toward Cotterill. "And no mirrors in the room, you say?" "No, indeed, not one," which struck Miss Cray as peculiar. "She says the old woman had them all taken down a year or so ago, claimed she didn't want to be reminded." "Reminded? Of what?" Cotterill shrugged. "Of being old, I imagine." Wimsey's gaze had returned to the window. "Or perhaps," he said, "she didn't want to be seen." The canon gave a sharp little cough. "Really, Lord Peter, one might think you suspected foul play. The woman was nearly 90. Wimsey turned, his smile more mask than mirth. "Canon, you would be astonished at the number of ways a 90-year-old can be helped toward her heavenly reward, quietly, respectably, with the utmost consideration." He stepped through the threshold of the house, his voice floating back like incense. "And if I were going to commit murder, why, I might do it in a house just like this." The hallway of Grey Lady's smelt faintly of dried lavender and something harder to name, an odour not quite unpleasant but old in the way that linen locked too long in a chest might be. Lord Peter Wimsey stepped lightly over the threshold, noting at once the absurdity of the runner rug, worn precisely where it oughtn't be. Not in the middle, where years of passing feet would naturally wear it down, but close to the left, a wall as though someone had deliberately walked hugging the wainscot. Miss Cray, the nurse, awaited him in the parlour. She did not offer her hand, but instead inclined her pale head with a stiffness suggestive of both spinal trouble and moral certainty. Wimsey bowed with exaggerated courtesy. "My dear Miss Cray, your profession demands the utmost vigilance." And yet here I find you managing grief and disorder with all the aplomb of a hospital matron. Truly admirable. I dare say you have already made the teacups march. I've not touched the tray, she replied. That would be cook's domain, but I did, quite naturally, close the poor lady's eyes. Whimsy regarded her evenly, always kind to afford the dead a final gesture of propriety. And I believe you were the one to find her? Yes, I went in at 7:30 to bring her tea. She preferred it in the Chinese cup, the blue one with the willow pattern. She would not take it in bed, you understand. She insisted on dressing, a terrible stiffness in her hands, but I would lay out the shawl and she would do the rest. That morning she hadn't rung. Whimsy noted that. And yet, you went in. I always did, regardless. She had her ways, but she liked consistency. I knocked, of course. There was no reply. I found her. She stopped abruptly. She was seated in the chair, upright, fully dressed. Her eyes were open, but she had gone. Whimsy tilted his head, owl-like. In the chair, you say? Not the bed? No. No signs of distress, of movement or resistance? None. A peaceful end, then? Miss Cray hesitated. Yes, though there was something strange. The window was open. That is odd, Whimsy murmured, given that it faces due east and this morning's fog rolled in thick as an archbishop's sermon. Was that usual? She hated draughts. I always closed it before leaving her at night. She wouldn't have risen and opened it herself, not in the middle of the night. And the door? Locked, from the inside. I had to go round to the back and climb the stairs through the maid's corridor to enter from the servant's door. I used the passkey. Whimsy gave her a long, measuring look. And there were no mirrors. She folded her hands tightly. No, not one. She had them all taken down a year ago. Said she didn't like what she saw, said they lied to her. Indeed, well, I suppose one grows suspicious of reflections, as one does of old friends. Treacherous things both, if stared at too long. He rose. May I see the room? Miss Cray led the way. Her shoes made no sound on the wood, and Whimsy found himself listening for echoes that did not come. The stairs bent sharply, turning into a corridor that narrowed at the end to an old-fashioned door with a blackened brass handle, the sort that required turning and lifting due to a centuries-old misalignment. Inside, the room was cold. Whimsy noted the position of the chair, by the fireplace near a small side table with a teaspoon, the faint ring of a teacup still ghosting the wood. The bed was neat. A book rested on the coverlet, The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis, bookmarked not with a ribbon, but with a length of black lace. He moved to the window. It had indeed been opened. The sill was damp, and the outer latch hung limp. Interesting, he murmured. No footprints on the floor, I presume, though with this wretched fog one never knows what might be tracked in. I saw none, Miss Cray replied. And the door was locked. Yes, yes, the locked room. Whimsy sounded almost pleased. Tell me, was she expecting anyone? Not that I knew of. Letters? She received few. I placed them on the escritoire when they came, unopened. She liked to attend to her correspondence alone. May I? Whimsy approached the writing desk and examined the tidy array. One ivory-handled letter opener, a blotter, several blank sheets of paper, and one envelope addressed in a precise, slanted hand. There was no stamp. He slid the letter out delicately. My dear Honoria, you cannot hide what you are. Not forever. You know the time is drawing. Tierce. Miss Cray made a soft, strangled sound. You hadn't seen this. No, I checked the post, of course. But there's no mark, no delivery. Indeed, one suspects it was delivered by hand, likely slipped in overnight. You sleep where, Miss Cray? Downstairs, next to the kitchen. I never heard a sound. Whimsy folded the letter precisely and slid it into his waistcoat pocket. Did she have many friends? She had no friends, my lord. Acquaintances, correspondents, and a few enemies, I dare say, but no intimates. A tragic thing, that. The very old are often reduced to their habits and regrets. He turned toward the wardrobe, an enormous Tudor piece that took up the entire far wall. Would you be so kind? Miss Cray pulled the handles. The doors groaned, but did not fully part. It's always done that, she said. Warped from age, the left door sticks. Let's see what it chooses to hide. Whimsy bent to examine the lower hinge, which had been, curiously, scratched, as though recently forced or wrenched. He reached inside and pulled gently at the interior wall. Nothing gave, but his eye was caught by a peculiar arrangement on the top shelf, an old jewelry case beside a small silver frame turned face down. He extracted the frame and flipped it over. The photograph was of a man in clerical dress, his features oddly indistinct, as though deliberately smudged. "Canon Wilberforce?" Whimsy asked, raising a brow. Miss Cray gave a stiff shake of the head. "No, that's Canon Delane. He was rector here before Wilberforce. Died some years ago. He and Miss Dancy were close." "How very ecclesiastical," Whimsy murmured. He replaced the frame, noting a long thread of silver hair caught in the wood. "I think I should like to speak with the cook," he said, straightening. "And afterwards, perhaps, with Canon Wilberforce, again. There is a great deal, Miss Cray, that doesn't quite belong, including, if I may say so, the very neatness of this room." She blinked. "Neatness? Yes, you see," and here he gestured lightly, "there is a kind of order that comes from living and a kind that comes after. This, I think, is the latter." Miss Cray's face paled further, if that were possible. Whimsy gave her a faint smile and turned for the door. "And if you'll forgive me the liberty, Miss Cray, do have some tea. You look like you've seen a ghost, but I dare say we're dealing with something far more tangible." He left her in the quiet room, stepping softly down the stairs, as if not to disturb a house that had already begun the habit of mourning. Outside, the fog had thickened again, curling around the edges of the hedgerows like fingers withdrawing from a wound. Grey ladies stood behind him, motionless, as though waiting for him to return with the next question. Or the next lie. He would ask Cook about the cold meat next, and the candles, especially the one that had not been lit. The kitchen at Grey Ladies was redolent of rosemary and something less definable, an undercurrent of damp earth and burnt sugar, mingled with the faintest hint of something metallic. Cook, a formidable woman with a face weathered as much by long years in the hearth as by the unforgiving Sussex winds, looked up from a simmering pot with sharp eyes that seemed to pierce immediately through any pretense. "Ah, Lord Peter," she said, placing her wooden spoon in the pot and wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron. "I heard you was poking about upstairs. Terrible thing, that. Miss Dancy was a hard woman to know, hard as the soles of my best boots." Whimsy inclined his head with polite acknowledgement. "And yet you cared for her, I take it?" "I did what I could, though I confess she frightened me. Always cold, always distant, like tending a statue that might shatter if you breathed too loud." Whimsy took in the kitchen, the array of copper pans, the stacks of firewood, the neat rows of preserved jars. He noticed, on the old wooden table by the window, a small wooden box, unremarkable except that its lid was slightly ajar, revealing the glint of silverware within. "I am told you prepare the meals, but that the lady seldom ate." "Not since the illness set in," Cook replied, eyes narrowing. "She had her tea at 7, as was her custom. And she liked it cold, they say. Told Miss Cray she preferred the taste better so. Silly, really, but she had her ways." "Cold. Tea at 7, Whimsy repeated, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "And what of supper? Was it served?" Cook gestured towards the larder door. "Cold meat, mostly. There was a joint last week, but she hardly touched it. The rest was for me and Miss Cray, really." "Were candles lit in the evening?" "I am told the power sometimes flickers in these parts." Cook nodded, setting down the spoon. "Yes, candles and lamps, of course, but last night the candles in the sitting room were left unlit. Miss Cray noticed it. Strange, given the fog." Whimsy raised an eyebrow. "Left unlit deliberately, do you think?" Cook shrugged. "Perhaps. The old lady was peculiar about her rituals. Some days she'd light candles in a pattern, some days not. No one could say why." "Anything else unusual?" Cook tapped a finger on her chin. "Well, the back pantry, it's always been stiff, but someone had forced it open last night. It shouldn't open from the outside without a key. That fits with the locked room scenario," Whimsy mused. "Did Miss Cray notice this?" "No, but I did when I fetched more firewood. Thought I'd imagined it, but the latch was loose this morning." Whimsy's gaze sharpened. "You say Miss Dancy was peculiar about her rituals. Might you elaborate?" Cook shrugged again. She said she was cleaning the house of ghosts, had a whole routine, moving furniture, opening windows at odd hours, said it kept the spirits honest. Whimsy smiled thinly. A charming superstition, though I dare say Our Lady of Grey Ladies preferred ghosts to mirrors. Cook laughed, a rough sound like gravel shifting underfoot. That's true enough. She had no mirrors in the house since the year before last. Took 'em all down and put sheets over the frames. Said they showed things no one should see. Fear of reflection, then? Fear of truth, perhaps? Whimsy looked thoughtfully towards the window, where the fog clung to the glass like a shroud. Miss Dancy's habits are certainly eccentric. Cook's face darkened. Eccentric? Aye, but she was lonely too. All her family gone or dead. Left to the village and her books. Sometimes I think she talked to the walls more than the living. Whimsy nodded, feeling the faint pulse of unease that always accompanied such loneliness. And the canon? What role does he play here? Cook's eyes flicked to the door. Canon Wilberforce, he's a regular caller, especially since the last rector died. They say she and the old Canon Delane were thick as thieves, whatever that means with clergy. Wilberforce seems more business than friendship. I see, and how did the villagers react to her passing? Cook shook her head. Quiet, mostly. Some curious, some relieved. She wasn't one for smiles or charity. A hard woman, like I said. Whimsy thanked Cook and left the kitchen, stepping back into the gloom of the hall where the house seemed to exhale a slow, resigned breath. The creak of the floorboards beneath his feet echoed in the silence like a ticking clock, marking time yet refusing to yield its secrets. He made his way to the drawing-room, where Canon Wilberforce had taken up his vigil with a book, but no apparent interest. The canon looked up, his face pale and drawn, eyes sharp beneath bushy brows. Lord Peter, I fear we tread on sacred ground in more ways than one. Whimsy smiled thinly. Your pardon, Canon, but sacred ground is often the most profane. I trust you find the house as atmospheric as I do. The canon gave a dry chuckle. Atmospheric? It feels like a mausoleum. The old woman's austerity has settled like a pall. Indeed. And yet you visit regularly, I hear? Yes, my duty as parish priest. She was a distant parishioner, but steadfast in her faith. I came to offer comfort. More often I found her in prayer or in that chair by the fire. Did you notice anything unusual about her last days? Any visitors or disturbances? Wilberforce shook his head slowly. No visitors, save myself. The old Canon Delane's portrait hung over the mantel. She would speak to it sometimes as though seeking counsel. Whimsy gestured toward the photograph Miss Cray had shown him. There is something smudged about it. Yes, a curious thing. Miss Dancy apparently asked me to have it touched up, but I demurred. I could not find anyone who would willingly restore an image of a man long dead. Besides, she said she preferred it this way, less temptation to nostalgia. Fascinating. And the letter found in her desk? Wilberforce's eyes flickered. I was unaware of any letter. You have me at a disadvantage, Lord Peter. Forgive my silence. It was unsigned except for a C. A warning or a threat, hard to tell. The canon's mouth tightened. I cannot think who it might be. Whimsy studied him for a moment, then pivoted to pace the room. The missing mirrors, the open window, the locked door, the unlit candles. I begin to wonder if Miss Dancy sought to imprison herself in a world devoid of reflection and light. Wilberforce frowned. Or perhaps she was trying to keep something out. Or someone. Precisely my thought. Whimsy paused by the fireplace, fingers resting on the mantel. Tell me, Canon, how well do you know the local geography, the villages, the oddities peculiar to this place? Somewhat. Coldmead is a quiet village, but there are tensions, family feuds, debts, resentments. Nothing out of the ordinary. Yet, Whimsy smiled faintly, in a village so steeped in history and secrecy, one ought never to trust the surface. Wilberforce inclined his head, visibly uncomfortable. As you say, if I may be frank, Lord Peter, there are some here who prefer silence to truth, and Miss Dancy was, in some respects, a keeper of those silences. Whimsy took this in, then looked to the window once more. The fog had thinned slightly, revealing the skeletal branches of the ancient yew trees that ringed the property. Somewhere beyond the gloom, a church bell tolled, echoing hollow and distant. "The stage is set," he murmured, "but the players are hidden behind curtains too thick for casual observation." He glanced at the canon. "I believe my next step is to examine the timeline of last night, who came, who went, and when. There is something about the lock and the open window that will not rest quietly." Wilberforce nodded. "You have my full cooperation." As Whimsy prepared to leave, a sudden thought struck him. "Canon, before I go, one last thing. Miss Dancy had no mirrors, but what of photographs, other than that blurred portrait?" The canon hesitated, then shook his head. "None that I know of." "Odd," Whimsy murmured, as he stepped out into the gathering dusk. A house without mirrors, without photographs, almost as though she sought to erase herself from reflection. Altogether. Outside, the fog had lifted further, but the chill in the air remained, sharp and unyielding. The secrets of grey ladies seemed to press close now, their outlines clearer, but still shadowed. Whimsy lit a cigarette and inhaled deeply, the smoke curling like a question mark. It was time to map the final movements of that last evening, to unravel the threads of silence and shadows, and to discover why the old woman with no mirrors had chosen to die alone, yet surrounded by invisible witnesses. He headed toward the village, where a night watchman and the local constable might provide the chronology he required, and where perhaps the first true fault line in the carefully maintained facade would begin to show. The game, as always, was afoot. The village of Coldmead was no place for sudden disturbances, and yet as Lord Peter Whimsy approached the small constabulary, he found the air thick with a mild unease, as if the fog that hung over grey ladies had seeped into the very bones of the place. The constable on duty, a man named Harper with a face as weather-beaten as the cook's but lacking her sharpness of gaze, greeted him with a nod that suggested more fatigue than suspicion. "Good evening, my lord," Harper said, peering over the rim of his spectacles. "The murder's got the village talking, as you'd expect. Strange business, that locked room. They say the old lady was a hard woman, but no one thought she'd come to such an end." Whimsy smiled thinly. "Strange indeed, constable. I'm eager to understand the precise movements of last night. Might I trouble you for a reconstruction of who came and went from Grey Ladies after dusk?" Harper nodded. "Certainly. We set a watch of sorts, after the body was found this morning. But last night the village was quiet. No visitors to the house save the Canon Wilberforce. He came just before 7 and stayed until after 8. "That fits with what I was told," Whimsy said, pulling out a notebook. "And the servants? Any sign of comings or goings?" "Cook and Miss Cray were on duty inside. No sign of anyone else. The maid said she heard nothing unusual, though with the fog sound carries strangely. And the gatekeeper reported no disturbances." Whimsy tapped his pen thoughtfully. "Fog can play tricks on perception. Tell me, did anyone see the lights in the house last night? Were candles lit as usual?" Harper rubbed his chin. "That's the oddest part. The sitting-room candles were dark from at least 7 till 9. Miss Cray noticed and mentioned it to me this morning. Strange, since the power was off in the village due to repairs. No lamps either. Very curious," Whimsy mused. "And the window in the ladies' room, was it noticed open before dawn? Cook found it open this morning when she came in to prepare breakfast. No footprints outside, though the ground was damp from the fog." Whimsy made a note. "No footprints. That suggests whoever opened it was careful, or perhaps the window was left open earlier." Harper shrugged. "We searched the grounds, but the fog made it hard to spot anything. No signs of forced entry at the gate, no broken locks on the doors. And the back pantry door? Stiff as always, but someone forced it open sometime during the night by the look of it. We found it ajar when we arrived." Whimsy smiled faintly, recalling Cook's words. "A forced door without footprints? This house is full of contradictions." Harper looked puzzled. "I don't understand what you mean, my lord." Whimsy leaned in, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Neither do I. But I intend to find out. Tell me, has anyone seen a sea in the village recently? Anyone known to deliver threatening letters?" Harper shook his head. "No one comes to mind. The village is too small for such intrigues, or so they say. Though there's old Mr. Carter. He's a reclusive fellow, lives out by the moor. He's been known to scribble notes to himself and talk about secrets no one else understands." Whimsy nodded, filing away the information. "I shall pay Mr. Carter a visit. Thank you, Constable." As Whimsy left the station, the air outside was sharp and tinged with the scent of peat smoke. He walked deliberately toward the moors, the path narrowing and roughening as it left the village behind. The fog was thinner here, revealing patches of heather and gorse, but the wind had picked up, carrying an eerie whisper through the skeletal branches. Mr. Carter's cottage was a squat, stone-built affair, its windows dark save for a flickering candle within. Whimsy knocked twice and waited. The door creaked open, revealing a man whose wild silver hair and rheumy eyes gave him the look of a man half in this world and half adrift. "You're the lord with the questions," Carter croaked. "I've been expecting you." "How delightful," Whimsy said dryly. "A prophetess in the moorlands. Tell me, Mr. Carter, what do you know of the late Miss Dancy? And this letter marked with a C?" Carter gestured him inside. "She was no friend of mine. Kept her distance like a cat with claws. The letter, that I know well, came from one Cassius, a name no one else here dares mention." "Cassius?" Whimsy echoed. "A curious choice. Historical, Roman, conspiratorial. And what might he have against Miss Dancy?" "A debt," Carter said darkly. "Not money, but old wrongs, secrets buried under Grey Lady's stones. Miss Dancy tried to keep them sealed. Cassius wanted them unearthed." Whimsy's eyes gleamed. Secrets, debts, threats, a perfect storm. And this Cassius, where might one find him? "Try the village pub," Carter whispered. "The Bell and Anchor. Ask for the man with the raven feather in his hat." "Thank you, Mr. Carter. Your warnings are, as ever, invaluable." Whimsy stepped out into the cold night, thoughts swirling like the mist around him. Back in the village, the Bell and Anchor sat like a dark jewel, its windows glowing amber against the encroaching gloom. Inside, voices rose in the smoky air, the chatter of fishermen, farmers, and the occasional stranger. Whimsy approached the bar, noting immediately the figure seated alone at a corner table, a tall man in a long coat with a hat adorned by a single black feather. The man's eyes caught Whimsy's at once, sharp and wary. "Cassius?" Whimsy asked, sliding into the seat opposite. The man smiled thinly. "You have a knack for names, my lord. What brings you to my company?" "A letter, a threat. An old woman who prefers no mirrors and an open window in the dead of night." Cassius chuckled. Miss Dancy was a puzzle, even to those who knew her. "Do you know why?" Whimsy pressed. Cassius's smile faded. "Because she was hiding more than her age, because some truths burn hotter than fire, and because not all reflections show what you expect." Whimsy leaned forward. "Then help me understand. What secrets did Miss Dancy guard so fiercely?" Cassius's gaze darted to the door, then back. "I cannot say here, but suffice it to say that the past at Grey Lady's is a tapestry woven with betrayal, madness, and something darker still." "Madness?" Whimsy echoed. "Call it what you will. The kind that unravels families, that drives a woman to remove all mirrors from her home, to light candles in strange patterns, to fear her own reflection." Whimsy tapped the table, a plan forming. "I will return to Grey Lady's at dawn, Cassius. Perhaps then, in the light of day, the shadows will reveal their shape." Cassius nodded. "Be wary, Lord Peter. Not all who smile at you are friends, and not all who vanish leave behind empty rooms." Whimsy rose, the air thick with portent as he stepped back into the fogged night. The village lay quiet once more, but the investigation had taken a turn deeper into the tangled web of human frailty and cunning. The riddle of the old woman with no mirrors was no longer merely a question of locked doors and open windows, but of the very nature of truth and the illusions we craft to shield ourselves from it. As the bell of the parish church tolled midnight, Whimsy felt the faintest chill, not from the cold, but from the knowledge that the game was far from over. The pieces were moving, the shadows lengthening, and the final act was yet to begin. The first flush of dawn brought a pale, hesitant light to the grounds of Grey Lady's. Lord Peter Whimsy, having left behind the damp shadows of the village inn and the moorland secrets, approached the house with a renewed sense of purpose. The night's revelations lingered in his mind. Cassius's cryptic warnings, the enigmatic letter, the oppressive absence of mirrors. and he resolved to peel back the layers of the old woman's carefully curated solitude. The house itself seemed subdued beneath the morning mist, its stone facade slick with dew, windows dark and inscrutable. The fog curled about the yews like a reluctant veil, and the faint scent of rosemary from the garden mingled with the damp earth. Whimsy found Miss Cray in the small breakfast room, a modest chamber with narrow windows and a view of the overgrown garden. The young woman's face bore the weariness of interrupted sleep and the sharp anxiety of the recent tragedy. She regarded Whimsy with guarded eyes as he entered. "Miss Cray," Whimsy began gently, "I trust the night passed without incident." She nodded, smoothing her apron. "The house was quiet, Lord Peter, though I confess I had little rest. The thought of Miss Dancy, alone and frightened, it haunts the silence." Whimsy seated himself, fixing her with a steady gaze. "I must ask you to recount as best you can the movements within the house on the evening in question, the precise times of meals, visits, and any unusual occurrences." Miss Cray took a breath, steadying herself. Tea was served promptly at 7, as usual, in the sitting room. Miss Dancy drank it cold as she preferred, and afterward retired to her room. I helped her with the fire and lit the candles, but I did not stay long. She asked to be left alone. Did anyone else call that evening? Only the Canon Wilberforce. He arrived shortly before 7 and stayed until well after 8. I saw them speaking quietly by the fireplace. I was preparing supper in the kitchen at the time. And the candles in the sitting room? Miss Cray hesitated. They were lit when the Canon was present, but afterward Miss Dancy had them extinguished. She insisted on darkness even with the fog pressing close. Whimsy nodded thoughtfully. "And the pantry door, it was found ajar this morning." "Yes. I did not notice it the previous evening. Cook discovered it when she came to start the breakfast fire. Did you hear any noises, doors opening or closing?" Miss Cray shook her head. "No. The house was silent except for the fire and the ticking of the clocks." "Speaking of clocks," Whimsy said with a touch of wryness, "which timepiece do you trust most in the house?" She smiled faintly. "The grandfather clock in the hall. It has kept perfect time for years." "Interesting," Whimsy murmured, making a note. "Thank you, Miss Cray. Your cooperation is invaluable." After a moment's pause, he added, "One final question. Did Miss Dancy ever mention a person named Cassius?" Miss Cray's expression tightened. "Never. I have no idea who that might be." With a polite nod, Whimsy left the room and made his way to the study, a dim chamber lined with bookshelves that smelled of old paper and dust. He approached the desk where the letter marked C had been found, examining it again under the soft morning light. The paper was coarse, the ink faded but deliberate, and the message cryptic in its brevity. "Secrets buried beneath stone and silence will rise to shatter all you hold dear." Whimsy pondered the phrasing. It suggested knowledge of something deeply hidden, something the old lady had guarded. He examined the letter closely, noting the peculiar curl at the end of the letter C, a flourish reminiscent of a calligrapher's hand, but not common in this village. He rose and paced toward the window, looking out at the garden tangled with overgrown ivy and the creeping shadows of the yews. Something about this house, its silence, its shadows, felt like a riddle waiting for the right key. Whimsy returned downstairs to find Cook once more tending the fire in the kitchen. "Cook," he began, "I have been considering the open window and the locked doors. Might you accompany me on a small inspection?" Cook raised an eyebrow, but complied, following him through the winding corridors and up the narrow staircase, to Miss Dancy's chamber. The room was austerely furnished. No mirrors, no photographs, only the heavy drapes drawn tightly against the fog. Whimsy approached the window that had been found open. It was an old casement, with iron latches that seemed stiff but functional. "Notice anything?" Whimsy asked. Cook examined the sill. "The latch has been disturbed. Someone opened it recently, for sure." Whimsy nodded, crouching to inspect the floor. "And the absence of footprints outside," Cook shrugged. "Fog might have covered tracks, but I doubt anyone could open this window without making a sound." "Exactly," Whimsy murmured, "which brings us to the question of soundproofing." He gestured to the heavy tapestries draped on the walls, the thick carpets muffling footsteps, the closed doors and shutters. The house was designed to contain noise to isolate the inhabitants. But for what purpose? Cook shook her head. Miss Dancy was always secretive, always shutting out the world. Maybe she feared ghosts or worse. Whimsy allowed a faint smile to cross his lips. Or perhaps she feared living ones. They descended the stairs, and Whimsy's mind raced with possibilities. The letter, the open window, the locked doors, these were pieces of a puzzle not yet complete. Someone wanted the old woman to remain silent, or perhaps someone wanted to silence her permanently. Back in the hall, the grandfather clock struck 10, its steady chimes reverberating through the house. Whimsy listened, noting the slight delay. In its strike, a subtle discrepancy from the clock in the kitchen, which kept more precise time. Time, he realized, was a vital clue. He sought out Miss Cray again, requesting she show him the locations of all clocks in the house. She led him through the rooms, kitchen, hall, drawing room, pointing out the various timepieces, each slightly out of sync with the others. A pattern began to emerge. The clocks had been tampered with, deliberately misaligned to confuse any attempt at reconstructing events. Whimsy's brow furrowed. Who would have the knowledge and motive to manipulate time itself within this house? Miss Cray looked uneasy. Only Miss Dancy and perhaps the canon, I would think. Indeed, Whimsy mused, the canon's presence last night and the extinguished candles take on new significance. His thoughts turned again to the mysterious Cassius, the man in the village inn with the raven feather, the shadow who spoke of buried secrets and shattered truths. The game was tightening around him. He resolved to confront the canon Wilberforce once more, to probe the priest's knowledge and test the boundaries of his cooperation. As Whimsy left Grey Lady's, the fog had thinned, the morning sun a pale promise behind the clouds. The village was stirring, unaware of the invisible threads being woven through its heart. The mystery of the old woman with no mirrors deepened, its shadows lengthening into the daylight, and Lord Peter Whimsy knew that the next steps he took would bring him ever closer to the uncomfortable truth waiting just beyond the veil. Lord Peter Whimsy found the Canon Wilberforce seated in the vicarage study, a dim room lined with theological tomes and faded portraits of long-dead rectors. The canon was a tall man, gaunt and pale, with eyes that flickered nervously beneath bushy brows. He offered Whimsy a curt nod as he entered, the faint scent of pipe tobacco lingering about him like a stubborn ghost. "Canon," Whimsy began, settling into an armchair opposite the priest, "I find myself intrigued by your visit to Grey Lady's last evening. One might say your timing was impeccable or suspicious." The canon's lips twitched into what might have been a smile, but the tension in his jaw betrayed a less genial mood. "My lord, I assure you my visit was purely pastoral. Miss Dancy was troubled, as you well know. I came to offer comfort." Whimsy folded his hands and regarded him thoughtfully. "Troubled indeed. I have learned that she had no mirrors in her house and insisted on extinguishing candles even on a foggy night. Such peculiarities suggest a profound unease." The canon sighed. She was a woman burdened by her past. Old sins cast long shadows, and some reflections, whether literal or metaphorical, can be intolerable. "Speaking of reflections," Whimsy said, "I have a question about the clocks in the house. They were notably out of sync last night. A detail that may seem trivial, but could affect the reconstruction of events." The canon's eyes narrowed. "Clocks can be capricious. I have no interest in their mechanics." Whimsy's smile was thin but incisive. Yet the time discrepancy might explain why no one noticed the pantry door was forced open or why the window was found ajar. Perhaps the timeline was deliberately confused. The canon shifted uneasily. "You suggest someone wanted to mislead the investigation." "Indeed," Whimsy confirmed. "And someone with access and intimate knowledge of the house." The priest's gaze dropped to the floor. Miss Dancy trusted very few. "Is that trust extended to you?" Whimsy asked pointedly. The canon's fingers twitched as he folded his hands. "I was a confidant, but not beyond reproach." "Did she speak to you of Cassius?" Whimsy inquired. The name caused the canon to stiffen. "Cassius is a shadow from her past, a man she feared but did not wish to name." "Did Cassius visit the village recently?" Whimsy pressed. Not that I know, but the village is small and secrets have many ways of hiding. Whimsy rose, signaling the interview's close. Thank you, Canon. Your candor is appreciated. Outside, the wind had risen, scattering leaves in a rustling chorus. The investigation was thickening, each thread pulled revealing more knots. The Canon's evasiveness only confirmed the presence of secrets yet untold. Whimsy next sought out Cook, whose keen eyes had noticed the ajar pantry door. In the kitchen the hearth was lit, and the aroma of freshly baked bread filled the air. Cook was a stout woman, her hands perpetually flour-dusted, her demeanor brisk, but not unkind. "Cook," Whimsy began, "the pantry door's condition troubles me. You said it was forced open." "Aye, my lord, it wasn't like the door at all. The lock was bruised and the latch bent. Did you see anyone near the pantry that night? Did Miss Cray or anyone else come into the kitchen unexpectedly?" Cook's eyes narrowed. "No one but me and Miss Cray, and the cookhouse door was locked tight. And the contents of the pantry. Was anything missing?" Cook shook her head. "Not that I noticed. Nothing was disturbed save the door itself." Whimsy nodded. "Curious. A forced entry with no theft. What would be the purpose, do you think?" Cook shrugged. "Perhaps to search for something hidden. Miss Dancy kept her secrets even in the larder." Whimsy smiled wryly. "Secrets in the larder. Rather fitting for a house that hides mirrors." Before he left, Whimsy took a moment to inspect the door closely. The hinges were old but well-oiled. The lock was of a common make, easily forced with a sharp tool. He found a tiny smear of dirt on the floor near the threshold, but the fog outside would have obscured any footprints. Whoever forced the door knew what they were doing. Later, as the sun began to dip behind the rolling hills, Whimsy found himself back at the village pub, the Bell and Anchor. The air was thick with the scent of spilled ale and tobacco, and the low murmur of voices created a comforting hum. Cassius sat where he had the previous night, nursing a glass of dark stout. "Cassius," Whimsy greeted, sliding into the seat. "I wish to speak further of Grey Ladies and its ladies' secrets." Cassius eyed him warily. "You're treading on dangerous ground, my lord. The past is not always content to remain buried." "Nor are secrets, as we have both seen," Whimsy replied smoothly. "You spoke of debts and betrayals. Tell me more." Cassius leaned closer, his voice a rasp. "Miss Dancy was involved in a matter of inheritance, a family scandal. There were documents, wills, and agreements that could ruin reputations. She feared exposure. Was the canon aware of this?" Cassius shook his head. "I doubt it. He sees only the surface. But others in the village, those with something to lose, would kill to keep those papers hidden." "Interesting," Whimsy said. "And where might these documents be now?" Cassius tapped the table. "Likely hidden. Where no one would look, behind a false panel in a secret drawer." The old woman was careful. Whimsy considered this. "And what of the letter you wrote? The one bearing your mark?" Cassius hesitated. "A warning, nothing more, to protect what little remains." "From whom?" "From those who would destroy everything, including her." The clock on the wall chimed 8, punctuating the moment. Whimsy rose, ready to leave. "Thank you, Cassius. I believe we are on the cusp of understanding." Outside, the evening fog had returned, swirling like restless spirits. Whimsy's thoughts turned to the discrepancies in the clocks, the forced pantry door, the open window, and the shadows behind Cassius's words. The house and the village held their breath, waiting for the moment when light would finally pierce the veil. As he walked back toward Grey Ladies, Whimsy's mind worked with precise deliberation. Each interview, each observation was a thread in a complex tapestry. The chronological inconsistencies were not mere accidents, but deliberate manipulations designed to confuse and mislead, and at the center of it all was a woman whose fear of mirrors was more than eccentricity. It was a metaphor for the reflections she dared not face. Whimsy resolved to delve into the architectural peculiarities of Grey Ladies, to examine every lock, every door, every shadowed corner. For in those details lay the key to unraveling the mystery of the old woman with no mirrors. The game was far from over, and Lord Peter Whimsy was, as ever, ready to play. Whimsy's return to Grey Ladies was marked by a sharpening of purpose, his mind a keen instrument, tuning itself to the subtle dissonances that had so far gone unnoticed. The house, with its suffocating quiet and unyielding stone walls, now seemed less a refuge than a prison for secrets, and every creaking floorboard or misaligned latch a possible key to unlocking them. He began where the peculiarities of the building were most pronounced: the absence of mirrors, the curious pattern of locked and unlocked doors, and the deliberate staggering of clocks. It was one thing to suspect these as mere eccentricities, quite another to recognize them as integral parts of a meticulously constructed labyrinth. The drawing room, to which Whimsy had not yet been granted full access, was his first port of call. The door, ornately carved but firmly shut, presented no key in sight. A small brass plate bore the name Miss Dancy, but no handle, only a latch from the inside. Miss Cray, summoned discreetly, confirmed the room's exclusivity. Miss Dancy never let anyone inside but herself and the canon. She said it was her sanctuary, and no one else was to enter. Whimsy's fingers traced the wood grain as he peered through a narrow crack between door and frame. The room beyond was shrouded in shadows, a faint mustiness of long undisturbed air hanging heavy. He noted the faint scent of lavender, mingled with something older, perhaps the scent of worn velvet curtains or aged paper. Turning from the door, Whimsy made his way to the study once more, pondering the letter signed with the elaborate C. Something about the handwriting nagged at him, a flourish in the curl of the C that hinted at education, perhaps even a familiarity with classical scripts. Could Cassius be more than a vagabond with a penchant for dramatic warnings? His musings were interrupted by the arrival of the local constable, a diligent if somewhat unimaginative man named Carter. The constable bore news of an unexpected visitor, a solicitor from London, one Mr. Edmund Halsey, who had requested urgent admission to Grey Ladies on the pretense of discussing the late Miss Dancy's will. "Lord Peter," Carter said with an earnest tone, "I thought you might wish to be present for the solicitor's inquiries." Whimsy inclined his head. "Indeed, Constable, such a visit may prove most revealing." Mr. Halsey arrived soon after, a trim man in his early 40s with a face marked by faint lines of worry and a sharp gaze that seemed to catalogue every detail. He greeted Whimsy with a courteous nod and wasted no time. "Lord Peter, I represent the interests of the Dancy estate. The late Miss Dancy left a will that is, to put it mildly, somewhat unconventional. It requires close examination to ensure rightful distribution." "Unconventional in what manner?" Whimsy asked, his voice mild but edged with curiosity. "The key will contain stipulations that restrict access to certain parts of Grey Ladies, and it names beneficiaries whose identities are somewhat obscure," Halsey explained, opening a worn leather briefcase. "Moreover, there is mention of a codicil, a supplementary document that I have not yet located." Whimsy's interest deepened. A missing codicil could be the very secret Cassius alluded to, documents hidden beneath stone and silence, as it were. Halsey nodded grimly. "Precisely. The estate's legal complications hinge upon its discovery." Whimsy proposed a joint inspection of the house with Halsey and Constable Carter. They began with the cellar, a dank space of low ceilings and rough stone walls. Here, beneath the floorboards, Whimsy's lantern revealed a faint outline of what might have once been a trapdoor, now sealed over and forgotten. "Notice the irregular masonry," Whimsy pointed out, suggesting alterations that conceal something. "The lock mechanisms in this house are peculiar, but not impenetrable." As they progressed upward, the party examined the pantry once more. Whimsy noted the bent latch and the smudged dirt. "Someone searched here," he murmured. "But for what?" Halsey frowned. "The will makes reference to a secret compartment, possibly within the pantry or the study." "Secret compartments," Whimsy said dryly, "are a favorite of those who deal in shadows." The study proved more fruitful. Behind a heavy bookcase lined with volumes of theology and poetry, Whimsy discovered a hidden lever cleverly disguised as a part of the moulding. A gentle pressure caused the shelf to swing inward, revealing a narrow recess. Inside lay a bundle of papers, yellowed and brittle but unmistakably legal documents, including the elusive codicil. Whimsy carefully extracted them, his eyes scanning the text rapidly. The codicil confirmed suspicions. Miss Dancy had altered her will to exclude her nearest relatives, instead leaving her estate to a mysterious beneficiary named only as C. Cassius, Wimsey said softly, or someone using his name. The papers also referenced the necessity of secrecy to protect the innocent from ruin and included warnings about betrayal and vengeance. Outside, the wind stirred ominously, rattling the window panes. Wimsey looked up at the old house, feeling the weight of unseen eyes. "Who stands to lose the most if these papers become public?" he mused aloud. Halsey replied, "The Dancy family, who claim to be heirs, and possibly the canon, whose involvement in Miss Dancy's affairs. There's complicated." Wimsey's gaze sharpened. Complicated indeed. The canon's reticence now seems less pious reserve and more a veil for deeper concerns. The discovery of the codicil was a pivotal moment. The investigation had moved from shadows to substance, yet the puzzle remained incomplete. Who was C? Why did Miss Dancy fear reflection, both literal and metaphorical? And what was the true nature of the relationship between the canon and the deceased? As night settled once more over Grey Ladies, Wimsey resolved to confront the questions that lingered in the spaces between fact and suspicion. The house was a stage, its rooms filled with actors and shadows, and he intended to unmask the final scene before the curtain fell. The old woman with no mirrors had left behind more than an empty room. She had woven a web, intricate and dark. And Lord Peter Wimsey, with his characteristic mixture of arch wit and relentless logic, was the only man capable of untangling it. Wimsey sat by the study's hearth long after the others had retired for the night, the faint glow of the dying fire casting flickering shadows on the walls, shadows which, in the dim light, seemed almost to move with a life of their own. The codicil lay open on his lap, and the revelations it contained churned restlessly in his mind. He had seen many a tangled inheritance before, but none quite so festooned with half-truths and deliberate obfuscations as this one. His eyes drifted across the parchment, where the beneficiary was indicated only by the single initial, C. It was no doubt a cryptic reference to Cassius, or someone who wished to use that name as a cloak. But what else lay beneath? The will's language hinted at deep fears, threats veiled in legalese. The phrase, "to protect the innocent from ruin," was repeated with a somewhat desperate insistence, as though Miss Dancy had been fighting an unseen enemy for years. Wimsey's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. It was Miss Cray, her face pale and drawn in the low firelight. "My lord, if I may intrude, there is something you ought to see before the house sleeps." Rising, Wimsey followed her through the shadowed corridors to the west wing, where the servants' quarters were located. They stopped before a heavy oak door, the handle worn and slightly loose. Inside, the small room was cluttered with the usual accoutrements of domestic service: mops, buckets, a broom, and a worn box of oddments. Yet what caught Wimsey's eye was a small tattered diary lying atop the box, its leather cover cracked and spine fragile. Miss Cray hesitated before offering it. This was found behind a loose panel in the pantry. "Just this morning," she said softly. "I thought you might find it of interest." Wimsey took the diary gingerly, noting its age and the careful hand in which the entries had been made. The first few pages were filled with everyday observations, weather notes, meal preparations, the odd complaint about a missing glove or a damp firewood supply, but as he turned further, the entries darkened in tone. One passage, dated scarcely a month before Miss Dancy's death, caught his attention. Had the sense again today that "the house watches me. The absence of mirrors is a burden as well as a protection. The others do not understand. They think me mad. But to look upon oneself is to face what the past has twisted. Cassius haunts my thoughts, and the canon's visits only deepen my fear. I dare not trust anyone, not even myself." Wimsey's eyes narrowed. The diary's author was clearly not Miss Dancy herself, but someone close, perhaps a companion or confidant. The reference to Cassius as a haunting presence rather than a mere name suggested an obsession or perhaps a menace. He asked Miss Cray who among the household would be privy to such fears. Who might have the motive to both protect and control? Miss Cray's face darkened. Miss Dancy was secretive with her trust, but if I must be honest, the canon was often the only visitor she saw, apart from myself and the occasional solicitor. Whimsy made a note to question the canon further on the matter of his visits, but first he needed to reconcile the diary with the other puzzle pieces: the forced pantry door, the open window, the unsynchronized clocks. Returning to the study, Whimsy examined the clock on the mantelpiece, a brass timepiece whose hands were an entire quarter-hour ahead of the grandfather clock in the hall. He then moved to the window, inspecting the latch that had been found ajar. The mechanism was old but functional, and the window opened inward with a slight creak that could be muffled by the ambient noise of the village or the distant bells. An entry or exit here would have gone unnoticed, Whimsy murmured. Yet the lack of footprints in the fog outside suggests a certain caution. He turned then to the bookcase, still ajar from their earlier discovery of the secret compartment. The mechanism itself is a marvel of subtlety. Who in this house possesses the knowledge and audacity to exploit it? A faint sound caught his attention, a soft tapping from the hallway outside. He opened the door cautiously and saw Miss Gray standing there, a faint smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "My lord, I think there is something you should know. I found this hidden beneath the floorboards of the pantry earlier today." She produced a small leather-bound notebook, its pages worn but filled with fine, precise handwriting. Whimsy took the book and flipped through the pages, which contained a series of coded notes and sketches. The drawings were architectural in nature, plans of grey ladies indicating hidden panels and secret passages. "This confirms my suspicion," Whimsy said. "Miss Dancy was deeply concerned with concealment, not merely of possessions, but of the very truth itself." The coded notes spoke of a chamber beneath the cellar, accessible only by a mechanism hidden within the pantry wall. This chamber, it seemed, was intended to house the most sensitive of her secrets. Then the forced pantry door was not an attempt at theft, but a desperate search, Whimsy concluded. Someone needed what was concealed below, and was willing to risk exposure to obtain it. Miss Cray nodded. "But no one knows if the chamber is empty or still contains what Miss Dancy left." Whimsy's mind raced. The night was deepening, and with it, the layers of the mystery. He would need to return to the cellar at once, with the knowledge from these new revelations, to see if the secret chamber held the key to the tangled past and present. As they descended the narrow stone steps into the cellar's cold embrace, Whimsy's lantern flickered against the damp walls, revealing the outlines of the trapdoor suggested in the earlier inspection. With Miss Cray's assistance, he located the hidden catch described in the notebook and triggered the mechanism. The floor shifted with a faint groan, revealing a narrow stairway spiraling downward into darkness. Whimsy hesitated only briefly, before lighting a second candle and leading the way. The air grew colder, thicker with the smell of earth and decay. At the bottom, the stairway opened into a small, cramped chamber, walls lined with dust-covered crates and cobwebs. In the center lay a leather satchel, its buckles rusted but intact. Whimsy opened it carefully and found inside a bundle of letters, documents, and a small cracked mirror, its glass dulled but still reflective. The letters were addressed to Miss Dancy, their tone desperate and fearful, speaking of betrayal, and warning her to beware the canon and those who would steal her legacy. The cracked mirror, no doubt the reason for the absence of mirrors in the house, seemed to symbolize her fractured past and the fragmented trust she had in those around her. Whimsy's thoughts were interrupted by a faint noise above, footsteps on the pantry floor. "Someone else is here," he whispered, signaling Miss Cray to remain silent. The house held its breath as the mystery reached its crescendo. The truth was close now, threaded through fear, secrecy, and betrayal, waiting to be uncovered in the cold shadows beneath grey ladies. The faint footsteps above echoed with an uncertain rhythm, deliberate, cautious, but too light for a servant burdened with errands. Whimsy's grip tightened on the candle, the flickering flame casting long shadows that danced upon the rough cellar walls. Miss Cray, pale as the moonlight filtering through the barred cellar window, pressed close behind him, her breath barely audible. "Stay silent," he whispered, voice a mere breath against the damp stone. "We shall see who dares disturb the house at such an hour." They ascended the narrow stairs, moving with practiced stealth until the trapdoor clicked shut once more beneath their feet. Upstairs, the faint murmurs grew louder, words indistinct but undeniably human. Whimsy's eyes adjusted swiftly to the gloom as he stepped into the pantry, his gaze sweeping the room with the precision of a hawk. There, by the edge of the pantry, window, the one found ajar earlier, stood the canon himself, Canon Mortimer, his usually composed features now etched with a stark and unfamiliar urgency. His eyes darted toward the pantry door as it opened, betraying a momentary flicker of alarm before he composed himself. "Ah, Lord Peter," Mortimer greeted, his voice a low murmur. "I trust I do not intrude." Whimsy regarded him with cool appraisal. "Intrusion is relative, Canon. You would seem to have been very busy." Mortimer's lips tightened. "I had cause to revisit some matters of the estate. The night offers a certain discretion." "Indeed," Whimsy replied, stepping fully into the pantry. "Might I inquire what necessitates such discretion at an hour when respectable society is abed?" The canon's eyes flicked away briefly, as if measuring the wisdom of confession. "Miss Dancy's affairs are complicated. There are elements best kept from prying eyes. Certain truths are better left veiled for the sake of peace. Peace founded on secrets seldom endures," Whimsy said softly, his gaze never leaving the canon's face. "Your presence here at such a time suggests that the sanctuary of grey ladies is less tranquil than it appears." Mortimer's jaw twitched, and with a sudden motion, he reached into his coat pocket, producing a folded sheet of paper. "I found this slip beneath my door earlier," he said, handing it over. Whimsy unfolded the note carefully. The handwriting was unmistakable, delicate, elegant, yet with a tremor of desperation. "Beware the shadows beneath the house. What is hidden will be revealed." Whimsy's eyes lifted to meet the canon's. "A warning, perhaps, or a threat, or a plea," Mortimer murmured. "I confess, Lord Peter, I have secrets of my own. I was deeply involved in Miss Dancy's life, more than is proper for a man of the cloth. She trusted me, though in the end trust is a precarious thing." "And yet you sought the hidden chamber as I did," Whimsy said. "What was your purpose there, Canon?" "To secure letters that might implicate me and to protect her reputation," Mortimer admitted, his voice low and resigned. "Miss Dancy feared scandal as much as death." Whimsy nodded slowly. "And the beneficiaries see in the will. Who is Cassius, truly?" Mortimer's eyes darkened. "A name she used for the one person in her past who betrayed her utterly. Cassius was no mere figment. He was a man who destroyed her family, whose shadow reached across years to claim his." "Due." "Then your loyalty was to her, not to her family or to yourself," Whimsy observed. "Yet the family and the police have been quick to accuse you, have they not?" Mortimer sighed. "I am an easy scapegoat. The village whispers of my failings, both spiritual and worldly." Whimsy's mind raced. The tangled web was clearer now. A broken past, a shattered trust, a secret love, and a legacy threatened by revelation. "Tell me about the night of her death," Whimsy said, his tone gentle, but probing. "Your movements, your knowledge of the house." Mortimer recounted his evening, a late sermon, a hurried return, a brief visit to the study, and finally a retreat to his chambers. He claimed to have heard no disturbance, save for the faint sound of footsteps near the pantry window. "And the clocks?" Whimsy interjected. "The discrepancy in timekeeping? Was it deliberate?" Mortimer shook his head. "I confess ignorance. Miss Dancy had the clock set as she pleased, perhaps to unsettle us all." "But to what end?" Whimsy pressed. "To conceal something? Or someone?" Mortimer hesitated, then confessed. She was tormented by the past, fearful that the house's own walls would betray her. Whimsy was about to press further when a sudden noise startled them both. A hurried footstep on the gravel outside, followed by a hushed whisper. The Constable Carter, entering briskly, caught sight of the pair and nodded grimly. "My lord, I have news. A man was seen fleeing the grounds just moments ago, head bowed, cloak drawn tight. None recognized him, but the time fits the window's opening." Whimsy's eyes gleamed with renewed purpose. "It appears our shadow has taken flight, but where to and why?" The canon looked away, troubled. "I fear the past is not done with us yet." Whimsy turned to the constable. "Gather the villagers. Secure the gates. No one leaves until we have spoken." As Carter hurried away, Whimsy faced Mortimer. "Your secrets and fears intertwine, Canon, but I suspect there is one more shadow still hidden, one that will cast the longest night upon us." The night air was thick with expectation, the secrets of grey ladies poised on the brink of revelation, and Lord Peter Wimsey, with that rare blend of wry humour and steely resolve, knew the final act was approaching, one in which the past sins would be laid bare and the true face of Cassius revealed at last. The following morning dawned with a pale, watery sun casting a cool light over the sleeping village of grey ladies. Yet inside the old house, the atmosphere was taut, the silence charged with expectation. Lord Peter Wimsey sat once more in the study, the scattered papers of Miss Dancy's affairs around him, like a battlefield strewn with the debris of secrets long suppressed. Outside, the village constable had succeeded in preventing any departure from the estate, while the household and a handful of curious townsfolk assembled nervously in the great hall. The missing figure from the night before was a subject of whispered speculation, but no one had yet laid eyes on him. Wimsey sipped his morning coffee, the bitter warmth steadying his thoughts. He had spent the night reviewing every fragment of evidence, each incongruous detail taking on new significance under his measured gaze. The clocks, the hidden chamber, the cryptic letters, all pieces of a puzzle that revealed a narrative both tragic and meticulously constructed. The door opened, and Inspector Parker entered briskly, his face set with the professional impatience of one accustomed to cutting through equivocation. "Lord Peter," he said, "I trust you have a plan to resolve this." "Most peculiar case," Wimsey smiled thinly. "Patience, Inspector. We are nearing the point where all shadows are drawn into the light." Parker grunted, his eyes flicking toward the assembled household members in the hall below. "They grow, restless. The servants, the villagers, they want certainty and quick." "As do I," Wimsey replied, "but certainty must rest on fact, not rumor or haste." He rose and paced toward the window, the morning mist swirling beyond the garden. The old woman with no mirrors had left a legacy more complex than any inheritance, a labyrinth of fear, love, betrayal, and calculated deceptions. The question remained, who was Cassius, and why had his spectre loomed so large that Miss Dancy would go to such lengths to protect herself? Wimsey's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Miss Cray, who approached quietly bearing a small bundle wrapped in faded cloth. She offered it with a tentative reverence. "I found this hidden beneath Miss Dancy's bed," she said. "I thought you might wish to see it." Wimsey unwrapped the parcel to reveal a collection of personal effects. A faded photograph of a handsome young man with eyes as sharp as any falcon's, a silver locket bearing an intricate crest, and a sheaf of letters sealed with an unfamiliar insignia. The photograph was labeled only with a single word, Cassius. Wimsey examined the face closely. There was something about the eyes, not merely youthful pride but an unmistakable hardness, as if carved from some darker experience. The letters, written in a firm but elegant hand, were addressed to Miss Dancy. Hare spoke of a scandal that had devastated 2 families years before. They detailed threats, extortion, and a calculated vendetta, a vendetta that had finally found its mark in grey ladies. "It seems," Wimsey mused aloud, "that Cassius was no mere name to conjure fear, but a man who lived, loved, and struck. With precision." He summoned Inspector Parker and Canon Mortimer, who had been waiting nearby. "Gentlemen, I believe we stand on the brink of unmasking not only a killer, but a carefully concealed history." Turning to Mortimer, Wimsey said quietly, "Canon, your involvement was clearly more personal than public knowledge suggests. Can you tell us about your connection to Cassius?" Mortimer's face paled, and he nodded solemnly. "Cassius was my elder brother, a man consumed by pride and bitterness. His ruin came at the hands of my family, and with it, a vendetta that spanned decades. I tried to protect Miss Dancy, but the past is not so easily contained." Wimsey's gaze sharpened. "And the night of the murder? What were you doing when Miss Dancy met her end?" Mortimer recounted his movements with care. An evening, sermon, a late study of parish records, a brief unnoticed presence in the garden. He claimed no knowledge of any intruders. Parker interjected, "Yet someone fled the grounds during that time. Who could it be if not you or one of the household?" Wimsey nodded. "That question remains. But I suspect our mysterious visitor is linked to the letters we found, the same vendetta written in ink and blood." He turned to Miss Cray. "You, madam, have been a quiet observer, but may hold the key. What did you notice last night when you found the diary and the notebook?" Miss Cray hesitated, then spoke. "There was a pattern in Miss Dancy's fears. She trusted no one, not even herself. The absence of mirrors was a safeguard against self-deception, and the pantry, the hidden chamber, was her last refuge for truth." Wimsey smiled faintly. The old woman with no mirrors indeed, a metaphor for shattered identity and fractured trust. He moved to the window and looked out at the gathering mist. It is time for the final act. Later that day, Wimsey convened the household in the drawing-room. The servants, the canon, the solicitor, and the villagers assembled under his quiet command. "Ladies and gentlemen," Wimsey began, "we have uncovered a tale of sorrow and revenge, a vendetta born of pride, and ruin that has festered in silence for too long." He recounted the hidden chamber, the coded letters, the inconsistent timelines, and the silent witness of the missing mirrors. The truth is this: Cassius was a man whose life was shattered by betrayal, and Miss Dancy, in her wisdom and fear, sought to protect herself and her legacy from his shadow. Wimsey paused, eyes glinting. "But the murderer is not the phantom of the past, nor a ghost of resentment. It is a living person, one who manipulated time and truth to cloak their guilt." He turned to the solicitor, Mr. Thornhill, whose composure had frayed under the weight of accusation. "Mr. Thornhill," Wimsey said gently, "you had everything to gain from Miss Dancy's demise. The inheritance, the estate, and the quiet dissolution of inconvenient truths." Thornhill's face flushed crimson. "You have no proof." "On the contrary," Wimsey replied, "we have your hurried departure, your knowledge of the secret chamber and your forged accounts. Your desire to silence Miss Dancy and claim her fortune led you to stage the scene." Thornhill's resolve broke. It was necessary. She was going to expose my embezzlement and ruin us all. Wimsey nodded. A motive both human and tragic. The household watched in stunned silence as Thornhill was taken away by constables, his protests fading into the murmur of the crowd. As the door closed behind him, Wimsey turned to Canon Mortimer. "Your past may be stained, Canon, but your courage in truth redeems you." Mortimer bowed his head. "Thank you, my lord." Finally, Wimsey faced the assembly with a wry smile. "Miss Dancy's legacy is safe, if bittersweet. And as for the absence of mirrors, it was never a superstition but a profound insight. Sometimes to see oneself clearly, one must shatter the glass." With that, Lord Peter Wimsey collected his hat and cane, offering a final, arch remark. "After all, if we are all reflections of our past, perhaps it is best we do not stare too long lest we lose ourselves entirely." And with a polite nod, he departed into the mist, leaving behind a house no longer haunted by shadows, but illuminated by the stark light of truth. The evening settled over Grey Ladies with an air of calm reclaimed, yet within the great hall the tension still lingered like a stubborn fog. The household had dispersed, leaving only a handful of figures: the canon, Miss Cray, Inspector Parker, and Wimsey himself, who stood contemplatively beside the dying fire. "It is curious," Wimsey mused, "how the human heart contrives such elaborate deceptions to shield itself from truth, only to be undone by the smallest oversight." He paced slowly, his fingers tracing the mantle's edge. The absence of mirrors in the house, Miss Dancy's peculiar quirk, was never mere superstition. It was, as I suggested before, a metaphorical safeguard. She refused to face herself directly, fearing what reflection might reveal. "Canon," Mortimer nodded, his gaze distant. "A woman burdened by secrets too heavy for daylight." Wimsey turned sharply. "Indeed, and those secrets formed the axis upon which this entire mystery turned. The hidden chamber beneath the pantry was her sanctum, a repository not just for letters and relics, but for the psychological armor she believed necessary." "But," Miss Cray interjected softly, If she so feared the past, why keep those relics at all? Because, Whimsy replied, one cannot flee shadows that define us. Miss Dancy was bound by her history, by Cassius and the vendetta that followed him like a spectre. Yet she sought control by erasing her reflection, hoping that by refusing to see herself clearly, she might escape the pain. He paused, eyes gleaming with the familiar spark of revelation. But control is an illusion, and it was that illusion Mr. Thornhill sought to exploit. The inspector, who had remained quietly attentive, cleared his throat. We have Thornhill. In custody, of course, but I confess there is one matter that has puzzled me still, the timing. The clocks were deliberately set out of sync, yet no one except Miss Dancy seemed aware. Ah, Whimsy smiled. The clocks were the linchpin of the deception. Thornhill manipulated them to provide an alibi and to confuse the investigation. But he failed to account for the kitchen clock, which remained accurate. Because, Miss Cray whispered, it was out of his reach. Precisely, Whimsy said. And this discrepancy allowed us to reconstruct the true chronology of events, exposing his falsehood. He stepped toward the window, gazing out at the silvered countryside. As for Cassius, he was not a ghost, nor a mythical villain, but a man very much alive. Though long vanished from these parts, his name persisted as a warning. It was this lingering fear that Miss Dancy sought to master, even as it mastered her. Canon Mortimer sighed. A tragic end, but at least now the truth may bring some peace. Whimsy raised his glass, a gesture of quiet homage. To peace. Then, elusive though it may be, the group murmured assent, the fire crackling as the last embers glowed with a gentle warmth. As Whimsy prepared to take his leave, he paused by the door, casting one last glance back at the house, this vessel of whispered secrets and mirrored absences. Remember, he said softly, sometimes the most dangerous illusions are those we craft ourselves, and sometimes the absence of a mirror is the most honest reflection of all. With that, Lord Peter Whimsy stepped into the night, the crisp air brushing his cheek and the faintest trace of a smile playing about his lips. The old woman's house finally could rest,